You indicated that something was of significance to you in this photograph about the diffusers on the subject taillight, correct?
Correct.
Describe, now that you're holding that, what was it that was of note to you, Dr. Wolfe?
So as I mentioned, we have damage not only to this outer thick portion, but it was enough force and energy to then penetrate deep enough to fracture the underlying diffusers that sit below this outer surface, and certainly enough force then to work its way back through inducement into the backside, and ultimately there was a top portion of the taillight that was also fractured up here.
Was all that significant to you in your review of the subject taillight material?
Yes.
Okay, you can go ahead and put that away.
All right, so that can't go back there because it's in evidence, so why don't we take it and...
I was just going to store it there until he's finished with his testimony, and then we can give it to the clerk magistrate.
Okay.
However you want to do it, Your Honor.
Right.
I have
Do
no
you wanna
preference.
take it? Is he using it still for his testimony?
Not right now.
All right, so, thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay?
May I continue?
Yes.
Can we go to the next slide? What are we looking at here?
This is a collection of photographs that depict various fragments from the right rear tail lamp assembly of the Lexus. And I will note that, and I'll try to spotlight it, there are a few fragments in this photograph that are glass fragments, which, as I discussed earlier, there's no glass in the taillight, so these did not originate from the assembly. But altogether, from what I recall, there's about 50 fragments, I believe, that were counted or so, maybe a little less than that from the right taillight.
If we could go to the next slide, please. What are we looking at here?
So these are photographs depicting the sweatshirt or hoodie that Mr. John O'Keefe was wearing on the night of the alleged incident.
And what was the role that this played in your analysis, ultimately?
Well, so one of the things that I noted, and I can go to the next slide, is there were a series of small punctures or holes in the sleeve, on the right sleeve of the sweatshirt, in varying sizes. I think some as small as just a few millimeters. Again, I think there was maybe 10 or 12, I think I recall, on the right sleeve of that sweatshirt.
If we could go back to the larger photo, previous slide, do you see the right sleeve denoted on the photograph to the right?
Yes.
Does it? Your review of these photographs, what was the significance of the triangular sort of arrows or markers?
I believe those were to annotate or draw attention to those holes.
Okay, the defects in the right sleeve?
Correct.
Can you count those for us, please?
On the photograph on the right, I believe I see a total of 9.
And what about the photograph on the left, just the right sleeve area?
9 as well.
If we can go to the next slide. What are the arrows pointing to in these photographs?
So this is basically the previous shot, but what appears to be close-ups of some of those evidence markers.
You indicated some of the sizes. What were some of the smaller sizes of those defects or holes?
From what I recall, like I said, I think it was around 3 to 5 millimeters, maybe some of the smaller ones.
How big is 3 millimeters in inches?
It'd be probably around like an eighth of an inch or so.
Can we go to the next slide, please? What are you describing when you say the word fundamental, or do you write the word fundamentals?
So I want to discuss some very basic concepts that I hope will kind of resonate as we go through the PowerPoint, so that you have an understanding of the underlying physics and what I'm talking about.
Can you go ahead and describe the role of an accident reconstructionist and the fundamentals that an accident reconstructionist undertakes when performing the kind of testing that you performed?
So, as I mentioned earlier, when I was describing what a simple definition of accident reconstruction is, it's the application of of physics and engineering to collision events. So this is, I want to go through some very basic elements of that so that you have an understanding of the physics.
Can we go to the next slide, please? What are we looking at here?
So this might be something you all remember back from high school physics, but even though it's been around since the late 1600s, we still use these laws today. So what we're looking at here is what I've done is just describe Newton's laws very simply. So, and again, you might be familiar with these. So, for instance, if we're talking about Newton's first law, an object at rest tends to stay at rest and at a constant speed unless it's acted on by an outside force, right? So if my arm is just here, right, it's just going to stay there until I give it a push or a pull, right? When I do that, that's going to induce an acceleration, right? So that's when we get into Newton's law, where if I apply a force to a mass, I'm going to cause it to change its speed. It's going to accelerate. And then Newton's third law, basically the law of reaction, indicates that when I push on my arm, there's also an equal and opposite force going back to my hand that I'm pushing with.
What role did these three very fundamental laws of physics play in your reconstruction or your ultimate opinions and conclusions following your accident reconstruction in this case?
So when we're talking about the concept of acceleration, what you will see in the dynamic test that we did and conducted, we measured the acceleration of an arm when it's impacted by a taillight. If we know the mass of the arm and we've measured the acceleration, we can use Newton's second law, which is force is equal to mass times the acceleration, to calculate what that force is applied on the arm, which ultimately you will hear from my colleague, Dr. Rentschler, to talk about that.
Is that broadly considered a force analysis?
Yes.
What role did force analysis, your force analysis, play in the accident reconstruction that you did or you undertook in this case?
Well, there's certainly going to be a correlation between the impact speed and the damage that we see. The higher the impact speed, the greater the force. So from my perspective, I was interested in the speed and the force to look at what's the observed damage to the test taillights that we did.
Do you think that's fundamental to an accident reconstruction?
Yes.
Did Dr. Welcher engage in any force analysis with regard to John O'Keefe's arm and the taillight?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Let's move to the next slide, please. What are we looking at here?
So don't be too afraid. This is some really simple equations that I want to show you. So that first one, delta V. So what do I mean by that? That simply just means you can think of delta, change in. So change in velocity. So if you look at that equation, the change in velocity, really simple. If I've got an object that's, let's say it's initially, for what V naught is, initially at 0 miles per hour, I hit it, and it's now moving 10 miles per hour. That means it underwent a change in speed of 10 miles an hour and is moving at that velocity. Acceleration is essentially how quickly did that velocity change occur, right? Did it go from 10 miles an hour in a split second, or did it go to 10 miles an hour over a few seconds? So depending on the timing of how quickly that change in velocity occurred will determine what the acceleration is. And as I've already mentioned on the previous slide with Newton's second law, we can then take that information about acceleration and apply it to, if we have a known mass, to calculate what the force on that object is.
How did these math equations, delta V, acceleration, force, how did these play into, what role did they play in terms of the accident reconstruction here, in this case?
Well, they're extremely fundamental. And I think as we go through the PowerPoint, you'll have an appreciation and understanding of what these concepts are. You'll see that I have plotted graphs with acceleration that shows the rate in that change in speed over time. You will see graphs of delta V, so the change in speed of the arm as it's being impacted by the taillight. And then ultimately we can calculate the force of that impact to be able to assess whether or not there's a mechanism for the injuries. And as I mentioned, that'll be my colleague, Dr. Rentschler, that will discuss that.
Can I ask you about delta V specifically? I'd like to focus on that for a second. Is that okay?
Yes.
when you say that that equation suggests or dictates that an object that is struck by another object with mass moves up to the same speed of the object that struck it, describe that in a little bit more detail in colloquial terms, if you will. Sixth grade terms.
I'm sorry, can you rephrase the question?
Probably not, because I don't understand it as well as you do. If an object, does delta V describe the circumstance in which you have an object that may be at rest and it's struck by another object moving? Is that calculating the speed at which the object that is struck moves to the same speed as the object that struck it? Objection.
So that's sustained. Just ask him a simple question, let him answer.
Easier said than done, Your Honor. Sure. Can you describe in more conversational terms what delta V is describing in terms of mathematics?
Right. So let's just give an example specific to this case. If the majority of the arm is struck by a 6,000-pound vehicle moving, let's say, at 20 miles an hour, that arm will experience a change in speed. It'll go from 0 up to about 20 miles per hour due to that impact. So that would be the change in speed. If my arm is at rest, stationary, is impacted by a 6,000-pound vehicle, it's going to change its speed up to roughly what that impact speed is.
And what about acceleration? What are you describing, or what is math or physics describing in that equation in terms of the time it takes for that arm to now move from 0 to 20?
Right, so that's how quickly that change in speed is occurring. So to give you maybe an example you're more familiar with, let's say you're driving down the road, you come up, you see a red light at the intersection, right? You're going to get on the brakes lightly, and your vehicle is going to change in speed, right? It's going to slowly decelerate. Let's say you're driving and a deer jumps out in front of you, you got to slam on the brakes, right? You're going to change your speed much quicker. So that's an example of two different rates of acceleration. One where you're mildly braking, right? You're going to coast down slowly, versus a sudden, emergency in front of you like a deer. You're going to slam on the brakes, and your speed change is going to be it's going to happen much quicker with that acceleration rate.
Are there circumstances in which the acceleration can be from 0 to, say, 20 miles an hour in milliseconds?
Yes, when we're talking about impact durations, especially of this nature, yes, they're not going to be, we're not talking about the impact occurring over a second, 2 seconds. That's extremely long. Even a duration of a couple hundred milliseconds in the context of this is considered long.
And then, of course, the force calculation is associated with the delta V and the acceleration calculations. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
In what way? What are we looking at in terms of that a little bit more complex calculation?
Absolutely. So if you look at the bottom equation there, where I have force is equal to mass, and then that top component is the change in speed, right? That delta V, V1 minus V naught, divided by the change in time, T1 minus T naught. So if you substitute in that equation, right, that's delta V over delta T, which is acceleration. So there's a relationship between all of these equations.
And do all of these equations, or did all of these equations assist you in coming to determinations and opinions and conclusions concerning this case?
Yes.
Are these normally accepted methodologies in determining delta V, acceleration, force, all the force dynamics or impact dynamics in an accident reconstruction?
Absolutely. They are the core of physics.
Can we go to the next slide, please? What are we looking at here? Scientific method. What does that mean?
So the scientific method is a process that scientists typically use to be able to reach conclusions. And so you could think about it in this case, we make an observation, right? We have injuries to the arm. We've got a damaged taillight. So let's try to do some research to figure out, okay, has anyone done testing with that, right? Has anyone hit an arm with the taillight, see what happens, see what the forces are, right? And then we start to make a hypothesis, right? So what happens, it's kind of an if-then statement. If the arm contacts the taillight, does the taillight break? Does it not break, right? What's the hypothesis there? And at least my understanding of reviewing Dr. Welcher's work, it appeared to be that his hypothesis...
Sustained. Next question.
Sure. did you review, well, let me ask a different question. Going back to the calculations previously, the delta V, the acceleration, the force calculations that you described to the jury, did you see anywhere in any of Dr. Welcher's reports or his data that he undertook those core calculations?
No.